Welcome to another creepy story. Tonight, we're diving into a strange and unsettling tale that will make you question what's real. But be warned, once you start, there's no going back. If you enjoy stories like this, hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new scary story. Also, if you have your own real creepy story, share it in the comments, and we might just turn it into a video with your name featured. Let's get started. The phone call came late, the kind of call you don't expect in my line of work. It was an missing person or a family looking to trace their ancestors for a history book. No, this was different. It was from an old hospital in a small town I'd never heard of, Ashford, Georgia. The voice on the other end was soft, almost nervous. "There's something strange about this one," she said. "We need your help. It's not like the others." I'd heard all kinds of requests before, nothing ever really out of the ordinary for a forensic genealogist. Most of my work is dry researching family trees, tracing lost ancestors, identifying remains, offering closure where none existed, but I could tell immediately this would be different. I'd never been the superstitious type, but something about her voice unsettled me. The case file arrived a few days later. The man had been in his mid-30s, found dead in a dilapidated room. No ID, no name, just an anonymous body with no family to claim him. But buried in the notes were something strange details that seemed too precise to ignore. His organs had failed, his body deteriorated rapidly, but the doctors couldn't explain why. The cause of death was listed as multi-organ failure, unknown etiology. They were stuck, as doctors often are, with unsolvable mysteries. But it was more than just the physical aspect of his death. The autopsy report, the blood work, even his living condition, it was like something had been eating away at him for years, unseen and unnoticed. The doctors just didn't want to deal with it. But I was different. I started the way I always do, through DNA. I expected the usual results. Cousins, distant relatives, someone to tie him to a lineage. It didn't take long for the DNA database to spit back some matches, but these weren't normal. They were fractured, incomplete, scattered like broken pieces of glass. None of them were close. No direct family, just distant, almost useless connections. It was like his family line had vanished. I looked deeper. No history, no ties, no traces of anyone who could have been his kin. The branches of his family tree were missing, as if they had been deliberately cut off. And then I saw something. A recurring name, an old surname, one that appeared in multiple fragments, scattered through the centuries, but always tied to Ashford, Georgia. Something wasn't right. I felt it in my bones, a deep gnawing sensation that this wasn't just a man dying alone. This was something darker, something far deeper than an unclaimed body. I had to know more. I had to understand the root of this emptiness. I called the hospital back. The social worker who had originally contacted me agreed to meet in person. Her demeanor had changed since our first conversation. She was tense now, her hands shaking slightly as she led me through the sterile corridors of the hospital. I could sense the unease in her, the same unease I'd felt when I first looked at the case file. The hospital had seen many deaths, many unclaimed bodies. But this one was different. The social worker led me to a quiet room, one where the staff had kept the patient's personal belongings. She handed me a small, worn leather wallet. No ID, nothing personal except a photograph of an old cemetery. The picture was faded, blurry, but unmistakable. A cluster of tombstones, some crooked, some leaning. A few were worn down with age, and in the background, a lone tree stood tall and oak, its branches heavy with Spanish moss. I turned the photo over. The back was blank. No name, no date, no hint of who might have placed it there. That was the only thing he kept with him, the social worker said quietly. He would look at it for hours. Sometimes, he'd whisper something. "It ends with me," he'd say over and over. My blood ran cold. It wasn't just a photo, it was the words. "It ends with me." The phrase echoed in my mind like a warning. Was this just a coincidence? Or was it something more? I pressed for more details. The social worker shifted uncomfortably. "He was quiet," she said. "Very quiet, like he was listening for something no one else could hear. But there was something else strange, something in the way he looked at that photo." I asked about his health history, hoping for a clue. What the doctors had written about his condition didn't make sense. The standard answers, heart failure, cancer, stroke, had been ruled out. The lab reports seemed to contradict themselves. It was as if his body had shut down without warning, without explanation. Then came the strangest part. One of the nurses had sworn that on the night before he died, she'd seen something that made her skin crawl. She had walked past his room and stopped when she heard him whispering to himself. She didn't know why, but she listened. It ends with me, that was all. The nurse swore she heard him say it just before he collapsed. He was alone, no family, no visitors, just a man whose story was buried in silence. I couldn't shake it. It ends with me. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, but I had a job to do. I went back to my office, sat at my desk, and looked at the photo again. The trees, the graves, everything about the image felt wrong. There was something about it that gnawed at me, a deeper connection I couldn't quite put my finger on. I logged into the DNA portal and uploaded the patient's sample, but this time, I felt different. I knew this case wasn't going to be like the others. It wasn't just a matter of finding relatives, of connecting names. It was something far more sinister. Minutes passed, and the results began to appear on the screen. At first, nothing. No close relatives. But then, I saw something. The name from the cemetery. A match, but it wasn't close. It was distant, buried in the past, linked to families that had long since vanished. Names tied to Ashford, names that appeared in the oldest census records. Names that showed up in death certificates from the late 1800s. Names that were supposed to have died out. I stared at the screen, my heart racing. This wasn't a simple genealogy case. This wasn't just about a forgotten family. This was something deeper, something older than the records themselves. And as the connections started to form, I felt a creeping sense of dread. The man in the hospital wasn't just the last of his line. He was the last of something darker, and I was about to uncover it. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the screen. The more I dug into the fragmented records, the more I realized this wasn't just about lost ancestry. It was something more profound, more chilling. I wasn't merely tracing a family tree. I was following the twisted, knotted roots of something that had been buried for far too long. The surname from the cemetery appeared again and again in the old death certificates. But it wasn't just the usual causes of death you'd expect from the 1800s. Some of the records were just off. Children, whole families, wiped out in inexplicable waves. The cause of death listed as failure to thrive, wasting disease, and most unsettling of all, unexplained. I felt my stomach churn as I read the notes, feeling a heavy weight pressing down on me. Each record told the same silent story, a family line snuffed out before it could continue. But it wasn't just the records. The cemetery plot was repeating the same tragedy. Rows of headstones, weathered and crumbling, marked by the same heart-wrenching inscriptions. Taken too soon. Called home early. The ages of the children stopped me in my tracks. 3, 7, 9, 12, all short lives, all cut off too soon. And one name kept appearing across the gravestones, one that I'd seen in my DNA database. Morse, the curse of the Morse family. That's what the locals had called it. But to me it wasn't a curse, it was something far more insidious. It was the silent echo of a disease that had plagued them for generations. I had to know more. I needed to find out how far back it went. So, I turned to the oldest records I could find, census data, local church registries, everything I could get my hands on. But the further back I dug, the more disturbing the story became. In the 1800s, the Morse family wasn't just known for their untimely deaths. They were whispered about in town. People in Ashford spoke of them in hushed tones, the way one might speak of something too dark to confront. I found an old church ledger, nearly falling apart at the seams. In the margins, scribbled in faded ink, were notes from the town priest, one who had officiated many of the burials. His words sent a shiver through me. A family marked by grief, he wrote. Their bloodline seems to wither. Even the land they farm is sick. There is something wrong with them. I fear it is a curse. A curse. It felt absurd, but as I pieced together the puzzle, it began to make sense. The disease, whatever it was, hadn't just been carried in their blood. It was part of their very essence. Every generation had watched their young wither and die, and instead of answers, they were met with blank stares from doctors who couldn't even begin to comprehend the affliction that stalked them. But I wasn't just going to accept folklore or superstition. I needed something concrete, something that could tie it all together. So I looked at the medical records, some of them archived at the town's tiny library. Most of the records were illegible, faded from years of neglect. But one document caught my eye, a note from the town's physician in 1923. He wrote of the latest death in the Morse family, a child, only 5 years old. The child's organs had failed, much like the man in the hospital had. But what struck me was the doctor's final, almost cryptic comment. Something is taking them, but it cannot be named. It is as though their very bodies reject life. I couldn't shake the feeling that the answers were right there, staring me in the face. The disease had been present in every generation, and now it had found its last victim, the man in the hospital. I could feel the weight of it, the endless cycle of grief, the unanswered questions, the family destroyed by something unseen. I took the records back to my office and spent the night cross-referencing everything. The DNA results had already shown a clear pattern. There was a genetic mutation, one that had been passed down the maternal line. But this wasn't just any mutation. It was mitochondrial, the kind of disorder that doesn't just affect one organ, it ravages the entire body. Organs would fail, muscles would waste away, and it often struck at a young age. I could feel the ground slipping beneath me as I pieced the science together. This wasn't folklore. This wasn't a curse. This was a biological death sentence. The deeper I looked, the more I found records from local newspapers, bits of gossip hidden in the old church newsletters. I even found a mention in an old will, one that was written in the 1850s by one of the earliest Morse ancestors. The will, oddly enough, didn't leave any wealth or property. It left a single instruction: let the line die. I didn't know what to make of that. The more I dug, the more it seemed like the family had known. They had known something was wrong, something was inside them, and they had accepted it. They had, for generations, simply waited for the disease to claim them. They had surrendered to it, and now, this man, the last of them, had whispered, "It ends with me." Was he the last victim? Or had he, too, known that the family's bloodline was doomed to extinction? I couldn't stop myself. I had to know more. I needed closure, something tangible to prove what was happening, so I requested a mitochondrial DNA sequencing panel. When the results came back, the truth was worse than I expected. The mutation confirmed the disease had been present for generations, but even more chilling was the way the family had reacted to it. I found letters written by family members, desperate to understand their condition. One letter from a great-grandfather described the agony of watching his children wither, knowing there was nothing that could be done. He had written about the disease as though it was inevitable, as though it was a curse they could do nothing to stop. As I read these letters, I felt something strange. The past wasn't just in these records, it was alive, lingering in the family's suffering. The letters, the graves, the DNA, they all told the same story. A bloodline ravaged by an unstoppable fate. The deeper I sank into the history of the Morse family, the more suffocating the atmosphere became. It wasn't just the facts of disease, the death certificates, the cryptic writings. It was the sense that something had been embedded into this family's legacy, something beyond the biology of it. The death, the grief, the silence, it all seemed to bleed together in a way that felt almost alive, like the family's very blood was imprinted with their suffering. I spent days at the archives, retracing every lead, reviewing every scrap of paper. Yet, the more I uncovered, the less I felt in control. The records themselves felt like a puzzle that had been purposely disassembled, pieces scattered too far apart for anyone to make sense of. There were gaps, long stretches of time where nothing seemed to be written about the Morse family. But in those gaps, I could almost feel the weight of their absence. It was as though their history had been deliberately erased, as if someone, or something, had been erasing them for generations. Then came the photograph. I hadn't even planned on going back to the cemetery, but something compelled me to. The photograph from the patient's wallet, the one he carried to his death, was still with me. It haunted me. There was something about it that I couldn't quite shake. I needed to understand it, to see the graveyard he had kept so close, and to find the family that had disappeared beneath its moss-covered stones. I drove to Ashford alone, the air heavy with the weight of history, every turn of the road leading me deeper into the unknown. The cemetery was on the outskirts of town, nestled in a quiet corner that felt as if it had been untouched by time. The old weathered headstones seemed to breathe with the past. There was a stillness to the place, but not the kind that brings peace. It was a heavy silence, the kind you feel in your bones. I walked through the graveyard, the sound of my footsteps muffled by the thick blanket of fallen leaves. The trees towered above, their branches draped in the same Spanish moss that had appeared in the photograph. I followed the path, tracing the layout of the graves, hoping to match the angles in the picture to the ones in front of me. The further I walked, the more I felt the eerie presence of the place, a sense that I was being watched, that something was lingering just out of sight. And then, there it was. The family plot from the photograph. The same crooked tombstones, the same tree in the background. But it wasn't just the photograph that made my heart race. It was the names carved into the stones. I recognized them immediately. The same names that had appeared in the DNA matches. The same surnames that had plagued my research. The first headstone I approached belonged to a child, only 7 years old. The inscription was simple, the words worn with age. Taken too soon. I moved to the next. Another child, only 5. The same phrase. I felt my breath catch as I moved along, each stone marking another lost life, each one another victim of the same unspoken affliction. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A grave apart from the others, its stone facing the opposite direction. Unlike the others, this stone was angled away from the family plot, turned slightly toward the woods. I stepped closer, the unease growing in my chest. This wasn't just an accident of placement. This grave, this mother, was separated from the rest of her children in death as she had been in life. The stone was worn, the name almost illegible. It was the same surname Morse, but there was no comforting epitaph, no words of love, no prayer for peace, only dates, only silence. I stood there for a long time, staring at the grave. My mind raced. Why had she been separated from her children in death? Had the family known something that they refused to say? Had they tried to bury their shame, their grief, their secret in silence? As I stood there, I realized that I wasn't just standing in front of graves. I was standing at the end of a story that had been buried, hidden, forgotten for too long. I wasn't just tracing a family line. I was uncovering the truth of their suffering, and I wasn't sure I wanted to know it. I felt the weight of the cemetery pressing in on me. I could almost hear the whispers of the dead, feel their hands on my back, urging me to leave, but I couldn't, not yet. I needed to understand. I needed to find out why. I reached for the photograph again, this time studying it more closely. The faded edges, the blurry details, they all seemed to lead me here, to this place, to these graves. I studied the tree in the background, the angle of the headstones. They were exactly the same. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I realized that the man who had died in the hospital had known exactly where his family rested. He had known their fate, their legacy, and he had carried that knowledge with him until the end. But what did it mean? Was this family cursed? Was it just bad luck? Or was there something more sinister at play? I didn't know, but I knew I was getting closer to something far darker than I had ever imagined. I returned to my office later that night, the photograph still heavy in my hands. I sat at my desk and spread out the documents, the death certificates, the letters, the old census data. I tried to make sense of it all, but it felt like something was slipping through my fingers. The silence in the office felt thicker now, suffocating. Every piece of evidence I uncovered only seemed to lead me further into the darkness. That's when I found it, the letter. It had been tucked away in the files, buried under a pile of census records. The handwriting was old, faded, but as I read, I felt the air in the room grow heavier. The letter was from the same physician I had seen mentioned earlier, the one who had written about the unexplained deaths in the Morse family. But this letter was different. This was a confession, not just about the disease, but about something else, the atmosphere in the room, the strange sensations he had felt during his examinations. I don't know how to explain it, he wrote, but there was something in the air when I worked on their bodies, something I can't name. It was as if the very act of trying to save them was wrong. The air was thick, the instruments would shake in my hands, and sometimes, I could hear a child's breath, even when the room was silent. The letter ended with a chilling sentence. I can't do it anymore. I fear it's more than a disease. I fear it's something else, something that will never let them rest. I sat there, staring at the letter, unable to move. The words echoed in my mind. Something that will never let them rest. Was it possible? Could the family's suffering have left something behind? Some kind of presence? The more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. The physician's words had struck a chord with me. Something that will never let them rest. Was it possible that the family's suffering had left behind more than just a legacy of death? Was there something in the air around them, some kind of invisible weight that had followed them through the generations? I sat there, the letter in my hands, the silence of the room pressing in on me, the feeling of being watched, the weight of history bearing down on MIT was all too real. The work I'd been doing for years, tracing family lines, solving mysteries, had always been about facts, about cold, hard evidence. But this felt different. This was something that couldn't be explained by DNA or records. This was something alive. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being pulled deeper into the mystery of the Morse family. Each new piece of information I uncovered only made the story more disturbing. The disease that had ravaged them, the eerie silence that had surrounded their deaths, it all felt too much like a curse. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to believe in such things. Not really. I was a forensic genealogist, trained in science, in facts, in truth. But what I had uncovered went beyond that. It was like peeling back the layers of a dark, twisted onion, and each layer only revealed more horror beneath. The letter from the physician had mentioned something else, something that sent a chill through me as I read it again. He spoke of the air in the examination room, how it had felt heavier when working on the bodies of the Morse children. But more than that, he described hearing a child's breath in the silence, something that shouldn't have been there. I had to know more. I reached out to the local historical society in Ashford. I needed to dig deeper into the town's history, into the folklore that had grown up around the Morse family. The more I dug, the more I began to see the connections between the disease and the strange happenings that had surrounded the family for generations. One of the old town records mentioned a fire in the 1800s that had destroyed a portion of the Morse family's property. The cause of the fire was never found, and many believed it had been started intentionally, though no one was ever charged. But what caught my attention wasn't the fire itself, it was what came afterward. The town's records described how the Morse family had begun to experience strange occurrences in the wake of the fire. There were reports of whispers at night, strange sounds coming from their home, and people swore that the family was being haunted. At first I thought it was just superstition, the kind of folklore that grows up around families with a long and tragic history. But as I dug deeper, I found something that made me question everything. I came across an old letter, written by a neighbor of the Morse family. It was dated just after the fire, and it described a visit to the family home. The letter mentioned the strange atmosphere in the house, the way the air felt thick and heavy. But what caught my attention most was the final line. They're not alone. There's something with them. Something that doesn't want them to leave. The more I read, the more the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. The strange occurrences in the Morse family's house, the whispers, the heavy air, it wasn't just the disease. It was something else. Something that had been following them for generations, feeding on their grief, their suffering. Something that had never let them rest. And now, as I sat at my desk, piecing together the final bits of this disturbing story, I realized that the last patient in the hospital wasn't just the last of the Morse bloodline. He was the last to carry the curse. I wasn't just tracing a family tree anymore. I was uncovering a legacy of suffering that had been passed down through the generations, something that no one had ever been able to escape. And now, it was finally ending. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't really an ending. This was just the beginning. I couldn't stop myself from thinking about the man in the hospital, the one who had carried that photograph of the cemetery with him until the end. He had known, hadn't he? He had known that his family's story was coming to a close. But what had haunted him was something far worse than just his disease. It was the weight of everything that had come before him, the whispers, the curses, the fear. It had followed him his entire life, just as it had followed every member of the Morse family before him. And now, it had claimed him, just as it had claimed them. I closed the case file, but the weight of it didn't leave me. The story wasn't finished. It couldn't be, because even when the bloodline had ended, even when the last descendant had died, the silence, no, the haunting. The truth was, it wasn't just the family that had been cursed. It was the land, the air, the very place where they had lived and died, and I had uncovered it. I had traced their bloodline, uncovered their secrets, and yet, in doing so, I had brought the haunting back to life. As I sat there in my office, alone with the case, I realized that the curse hadn't ended with the last of the Morse family. It had passed to me, and now, I too would carry it. The weight of the silence, the grief, the unspoken terror. It was with me, always, just as it had been with them. Thank you all for joining me on these journeys. Your support means everything, and I love reading your reactions and personal experiences in the comments. If these stories kept you on the edge of your seat or gave you chills, please hit that like button and consider subscribing for more haunting stories. Have you ever experienced something similar, or perhaps you have your own unexplainable story to share? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Each of your stories adds another layer to our growing community of horror enthusiasts. And if you think someone else might enjoy a good scare, don't forget to share this video with them. Stay tuned for more spine-chilling stories. And remember, sometimes the scariest tales are the ones that could happen to any of us. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video, if you dare.